Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of our case study of science denial. If you want to take a look at part 1, I'll leave a link in the description below or in the video. Today we're going to be taking a look at some of our denialist claims and knocking a few on the head as we have time. So looking through his glorious gish gallop of disinformation, let's just pick the pause for now. He says, explain the warming pause. I know, it went into the ocean. The last part being sarcasm if you didn't smoke it. The pause has been a propaganda talking point for a few years now and relies on cherry-picking a proximal high point in the temp time series and then using that as the starting point in an examination of the trend in the series. The denialists use 1998 because it was a very strong El Nino year, and the subsequent proximal years afforded but marginal higher highs, confounding statistical significance in the short term. However, our denialist is a parrot. He just parrots out things he sees on Fox News and doesn't seem to realize that the 2016 El Nino has broken the pause, and we're back in the realm of statistically significant warming. And here we are at our trend calculator, and our first data set reveals that we are indeed warming at a rate of 0.169 degrees centigrade per decade, plus or minus 0.116 degrees. The Berkeley set reinforces this at 0.15 degrees per decade, plus or minus 0.113 degrees. Next we have Hadkrut at 0.164 degrees per decade, and plus or minus 0.119 degrees. And anyone familiar with the short-term noise in the system knows that if we back up and take a longer view, the trend becomes even more stark at 0.195 degrees centigrade per decade, plus or minus 0.017. This is starting in 1990, about the same time the fossil industry started funding propaganda to say that the warming was not occurring. But even if 2016 had not been a big El Nino year, we can see from Foster and Rahmstorf 2011, which cleans up the temp record by subtracting out the short-term noise of the effects of the sun, the Pacific and Atlantic heat flux oscillations, and the effects of volcanoes, that a clear upward trend exists. It is indeed the greenhouse gas signal in the temp series. Our denialist would have known this if he would have followed the link I gave him to the journal paper, but he did not, revealing that he is not a skeptic, but indeed is a denialist. So now that we've eviscerated the pause propaganda, let's take a look at our denialist's sarcastic remark dealing with the heat that is going into the ocean, which it most certainly is. Examining summer Arctic sea ice minimum volumes, we find that between 1979 and 2016, we have accumulated a 12,454 cubic kilometer ice deficit. This is secondary to cumulative heat gain in the Arctic system, so let's perform a thought experiment on how much heat it takes to melt this large volume of ice. Discounting the heat energy it takes to bring ice up from a negative temperature to 0 degrees Celsius, and that energy that is involved in warming the liquid phase of such further, let's just take a look at the energy involved in turning that amount of ice to water. Well, it turns out that 12,454 cubic kilometers of ice is a mass of about 11.4 quadrillion kilograms, and it takes about 3.35 times 10 to the 5 joules per kilogram to turn ice at 0 degrees centigrade into water at 0 degrees centigrade. And thusly it takes about 4.05 sextillion joules of energy to perform such a feat. Keep in mind this is just one fraction of the cumulative heat gain to the Arctic system between 1979 and 2016, but it represents about 67,570,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bomb explosions, assuming all the heat from such an explosion would go directly into melting that ice. So indeed, Mr. Denialist, the heat actually is going into the ocean and melting a lot of ice and glaciers. Sarcastic talking point approved. I think I have time for one more talking point on our Gish Gallop, so let's head to the front of the list and focus on the fake expert our denialist calls Tim Bell. His actual name is Tim Ball, who was a professor of geography at the University of Winnipeg, Canada, but more to the point has no expertise in the physics of the Earth, and secondary to this lack of expertise, is not an active participant in the forefront of modern climate science. To further illuminate this point, let us compare our fake expert to an actual expert and gather the distinction. This is Professor Michael Mann. This is what an actual climate scientist looks like. He's a physicist with a bachelor's in applied mathematics and a bachelor's in physics. He's got multiple master's degrees in physics and in geology. And he's got a PhD in geology and a PhD in physics. If we visit Google Scholar, we find that Michael Mann is an actively publishing climate scientist, prolifically affording a body of knowledge in the most prestigious science journals in America or in the world. And we find multiple instances of such on the first page of our search. We also see Mann has his own Google Scholar profile. We see his work cited thousands of times. And again, we see him being published in Nature, in Geophysical Research Letters, in Nature Climate, in Science Mag, etc., etc. If we perform the self-same search for Tim Ball, we find only one lonely hit for the man as an author and 0 publications related to climate science. We can click on our sole hit and take a look to see what scholarly information he has provided the world. And it turns out he's co-written a book called 18th Century Naturalists of the Hudson Bay, and as we scroll down we find he has perhaps provided some interesting geographical information about the area in this book. Tim Ball's wiki page assures us that he has published some climate-related papers, so I went searching for them, and this is what I found. Something he wrote in the early 80s called The Migration of Geese as an Indicator of Climate Change in the Southern Hudson Bay region between 1715 and 1851. The abstract reads, "Observations and records maintained by the Hudson's Bay Company at York Factory and Churchill Factory on Hudson Bay between 1714 and 1825 serve as the source of information for a study of changes in the date of arrival of geese as a phonological indicator of climate change. So our author is basically acting as a historical stenographer for a couple naturalist observations of geese in a certain area of the world, and then trying to infer something about the local climate in that selfsame part. And we see a similar amateur naturalist's approach to observing a local climate in Tim Ball's other papers, nebulous to the subject. Hardly comparable to modern climate scientists' ability to use applied mathematics, advanced statistics, and PhD level physics to understand the contemporary global climate as a whole, further examining such with respect to geological deep time. Let us now examine what Ball actually believes with regard to the global climate, doing so by referencing his wiki page. Ball has said he opposes the scientific opinion on climate change and has stated that he believes global warming is occurring, but he believes the human production of carbon dioxide is not the cause. Ball rejects not only greenhouse gas-induced climate change, but the existence of the greenhouse effect itself. So in order to debunk that last bit of nonsense, we are going to take a look at what the temperature of the Earth would be were it to own no atmosphere, using just basic physics. The equation presented is the amount of solar energy entering a spherical near black body in the midst of space. L is the amount of energy being delivered to our sphere at where the Earth sits in respect to the Sun. It is about 1350 watts per square meter. Alpha is the Earth's albedo. It's the measure of how well the Earth can reflect energy back into space without absorbing it. It's just a number from 0 to 1. 0 being the least reflective and 1 being the most reflective. And pi r squared is just the shadow of the Earth, or the average area of the Earth that is taking in 1350 watts per square meter at any discrete moment in time. Our second equation is an equation showing the energy radiance of a spherical near black body in space for a given temperature of that. Epsilon is a measure of emissivity. It's just another number between 0 and 1, where 1 would be indicative of a perfect black body, and anything less than that would be considered a gray body. Sigma is the Stefan-Boltzmann constant. It's the amount of energy being radiated from a black body for a given area and a given temperature. And 4 pi r squared is just the area of a sphere, meant to represent the area of the Earth. Setting the energy input of the Earth system equal to its output, we can find a given temperature of the Earth for a given amount of energy entering the Earth system. The pi r squares cancel, and the alpha is about 0.33. Epsilon, for our example, will just be equal to 1. The Stefan-Boltzmann constant is just a number in a book. And when we put the 1300 watts per square meter in our equation, we find that the temperature is 253 Kelvin, or -20 Celsius, or -4 Fahrenheit. This would be the average temperature of the Earth's surface if there were no greenhouse effect in place. Luckily, the world does not work according to our geographer's fanciful view of it. The atmosphere does indeed have a greenhouse effect, and because of such, we enjoy a nice average 61 degrees Fahrenheit on Earth. If that alone does not convince you that Tim Ball is a charlatan, we can actually empirically look at the greenhouse effect using satellites. If one points an infrared spectrometer attached to a satellite down towards the Earth, one does not find a perfect black-body curve shown by the dotted lines on the graph, but instead it is illuminated that in certain frequency ranges, energy that should be leaving the system is not. For example, in the 600 to 800 wave number range, were the Earth's surface to be at 280 degrees Kelvin at the point of observation, it should be radiating about 120 units of energy. But instead it is only radiating somewhere between 50 and 60. And it turns out these big chunks of energy that should be leaving the Earth but are not are caused by greenhouse gas trapping of this energy. Each greenhouse gas has its own signature on this radiance spectrum. The 600 to 800 range is carbon dioxide's signature. The 400 to 600 range is part of water vapor's signature. And down at the very right part of the graph, in the 1300 to 1500 range, is methane's signature. Because of these unique signatures each greenhouse gas has, we can point our IR spectrometer at other planets and bodies to figure out the chemistry of their atmosphere. Here we see evidence that both Mars and Venus also have carbon dioxide in their atmospheres. To summarize, the curves on this graph represent the amount of energy that would be leaving the Earth system if it had no atmosphere. Each line is a different temperature for the Earth. We see that adding carbon dioxide to the Earth atmosphere reduces the amount of energy leaving, and if we add in all the other greenhouse gases, that reduces the amount of energy leaving even further. And the amount of energy being trapped by these gases equates to the difference between the temperature of the Earth without an atmosphere and its actual temperature. So when Tim Ball says there is no greenhouse effect, he is in fact saying that he is illiterate with regard to basic Earth sciences. I believe Ball is aware of his impotence in the matter because he spends a great deal of effort in grossly lying about his credentials to garner the veneer of authority. His Wikipedia page states that Ball claimed in an article written for the Calgary Herald that he was the first person to receive a PhD in climatology in Canada and that he had been a professor for 28 years. Claims he also made in a letter to the then Prime Minister of Canada, Paul Martin. Dan Johnson, a professor of environmental science at the University of Lethbridge, countered his claim on April 23, 2006, in a letter to the Herald stating that when Ball received his PhD in 1983, Canada already had PhDs in climatology, and that Ball only had been a professor for 8 years, rather than the 28 that he had claimed. Johnson, however, counted only Ball's years as a full professor. In the letter, Johnson also wrote that Ball did not show any evidence of research regarding climate and atmosphere. In response, Ball filed a lawsuit against Johnson. Ball's representation in the case was provided by Fraser, Miner, and Casgrain. Johnson's statement of defense was provided by the Calgary Herald, which stated that Ball never had a reputation in the scientific community as a noted climatologist and authority on global warming, and that he is viewed as a paid promoter of the agenda of the oil and gas industry rather than as a practicing scientist. In the ensuing court case, Ball acknowledged that he had only been a professor for 8 years and that his doctorate was not in climatology but rather in geography, and subsequently withdrew the lawsuit on June 8, 2007. In February 2011, it was reported that climate scientist Andrew Weaver had sued Ball over an article Ball wrote for the Canada Free Press, an article which was later retracted. In the article, Ball described Weaver as lacking the basic understanding of climate science, ironically, and stated incorrectly that Weaver would not be involved in the production of the IPCC's next report because he had concerns about its credibility. Ball contended that the lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to silence him because of his skeptical position on global warming, despite Ball's own 2006 defamation lawsuit against Dan Johnson. So here we have a man, a geography professor, struggling to deceive the public and the Prime Minister for the purpose of shilling for the oil and gas front groups that he is involved in. And when you see Ball in the media representing himself as a professor of climate science at the University of Winnipeg, please remember that the University of Winnipeg had no climate program during Ball's tenure. I believe that will do for now. I may make some subsequent videos in the coming months destroying more of our denialists' talking points. As with enough time and a little bit of effort, they all can be disassembled. Don't forget to check out Of Woodbridge and Hedgley, 99 cents on Amazon Kindle, which is a literary examination on the topic of science denial written in the setting of 1820 and 1821 Gloucestershire, England. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.